Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rama Patel. I'm Associate Director of Contemplative. And we're so excited to welcome you to the final few days of Marthand's amazing show, Escape Philosophy. It's been wonderful over the past, month and a half, just about month and a half, to see so many different types of people walk in and really resonate with the show in such different ways. And today we're really excited to have Ranjit Hoskote's incredible kind of intervention to help us think about the city in a very different sort of way. And to kind of begin, Ranjit's work has kind of really spanned 3 decades, both as a poet, a critical theorist, curator, and it's really exciting to have seen your practice. I'm from abroad, so it's been really exciting to see your practice online, but I'm very thrilled to kind of hear you speak today.
Thank you.
With Martand. And to kind of give everyone a brief overview of Martand, he's both an artist and an architect whose practice exists in dynamic tension between the built and the broken, the structured and the speculative. His work investigates how rapid construction and urbanization alter social landscapes. And I guess to speak a little further about collections that his practice has been in, it's been thrilling to see Marthand's work at the Curator Museum, the Navy Art Foundation, the Troll Foundation, among many others. So thank you both so much. We're thrilled to have you today.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for being here this evening. Yeah. As a first gesture, let me just say that it's really lovely to be doing a public conversation with you, Martand. We've spoken privately. We've also been fellow travelers on a project that cannot be disclosed, but which had ups, downs, and moments of great epiphany and great comedy along the way. Yeah. But it's marvelous to be here in this historic Art Deco building, in this space that runs so counter to Art Deco, and to be thinking with you about your work. And as a first gesture, I'll come to it later, but I'm going to reveal. This is Martand's grandfather's memoir, an English translation of Nisham Shahani's Aaj Ke Ateet, which has a delightful account of Martand as a 5-year-old child. I will not embarrass you by reading that part of it, but I will get to other parts of it at some point. But the reason I bring this into play is to think about where that title leads us. It's a very particular title, Aaj Ke Ateet, translated as today's pasts. The idea being that there isn't a single unilinear inheritance, and that there are plural pasts that we can draw on. And since more or less we belong to the same generation, we've gone through some of the same kinds of joys and crises. And when I look at your work, I'm just struck by how some of these dimensions come through. There's a tremendous sense there, particularly. It reminds us of the kind of space-age childhood that I think we had in the 70s. There's a tremendous sense of transcendence based on technology. There was a kind of technological optimism. But then through these forms of momentum, things gone awry, the vortex, there's also this sense of how technology, unmoored from the moral compass, has actually deranged our sense of what it means to be a collective. So I just want to explore with you as an opening move the powerful presence of time in your work. Time as moments of stasis on the side, time as something speeded up, as momentum. And I want to pin that also to the idea that you are usually referred to as an architect and an artist. Historically, the two figures have often been one. But it's only today where there's a kind of developer-driven understanding of architecture that you need to make the point that you stand aside and have more visionary concerns unrelated to built form, in a way. So could I draw you out in the first place on time and its effects and how that fascinates you. I've seen it repeatedly in the bodies of work that you've shared over about a decade.
I think it's a great sort of lens to start looking at it from, particularly in relation to this particular body of work for me, because my inquiry around has always sort of centered around the city, and what I have what I'm discovering as a practice is evolving, is it moved in from over a decade ago at looking at kind of the more granular micro aspects of law and rights, to sort of it's moved to a point where I'm sort of really looking at it as systems. And I think when you start to look at and there's a great jump between that, because there was a point where I was looking at the urban cities as having commonalities within the global south, but the great time jump was when the realization happened that when you start reading about London in the 19th century, or fast, rapidly industrializing cities, or looking at New York a few decades later, you find commonalities. And so therefore, how do we situate kind of the moment that we're in right now, experiencing it at an everyday point simultaneously, but also in commonalities of moving back in time. But geographically, the zones are shifting. But the stories, as we were just talking about, kind of erasure as well, and the idea of new cities coming on top of older ones, or how we erase, these stories remain quite common. And I think that the subsequent sort of move from there for me was very much about seeing systems. And I think that there's a point, I mean, I'm a bit nervous to say it at one level, because there's a point where so much of the practice was anchored with intellectual readings of cities and its systems. But I think I've spent so much time looking at it that there's a moment now where I find that at some level I'm kind of almost dancing with it. I don't know whether that's, so, when you see commonalities, there are these moments of flow. I mean, so much of the work is very much, for me, situated in the idea of resistance. And we could talk about that a little later. But this idea that, resistance and, how these common practices happen. And here are moments where I'm actually now sort of seeing time speeded up and then paused. But also, like, if I am using sculpture as a means of expressing an idea, or questioning, or probing an idea, can I take essentially what is a static form, but try and attempt to see whether does it actually give you a sense of a moment in a continuous. So, while I may look at some of these works, for me they're kind of they're in motion in time. So, but I'm trying to kind of get to that point just purely through a formal aspect of it. So in that sense, time becomes a very, very important kind of line of inquiry for me here. So
time and momentum. And in this context, I just want to situate the way you followed processes. Thank you. In terms of what we were talking about earlier, specifically about the research while you were at AA, but if you could also situate that for us in terms of what the School of the Architectural Association in London meant to you, because it has a certain presence for us here too. Generations of architects, your father was there for a while, Ashish Ganju worked with Cedric Price. There's a long-standing connection between Indian architects and AA, which began in the first place as a kind of a student-run solidarity with draftsmen. That's its history.
Yes.
And out of that comes this sense of a school which is always in a state of ferment, of research, and so on.
Yeah.
So what was that experience like for you, and how did that help you with or form a kind of a scenario where you could pursue some of these research interests in time, process, resistance in urban scenarios?
Yeah, I think the AA has been very, very critical, very central to at least the early part of sort of forming the way I start to think about it. I mean, as a school, for those of you who may not necessarily be familiar with it, it has actually really impacted our architectural pedagogy for everything, including schools in India now are borrowing those formats and kind of using it, because it held at its base the idea that you have absolute complete freedom, and that architecture is not necessarily only about building a building. And that, you know, and the modes of education and teaching very much reflected that sense of that you got in, that you as a student had the freedom to essentially formulate your own argument, come up with any solution, and as long as you could defend a position, that was what was important. And there was no marks. I mean, you either passed or you failed. Yeah, so that was it. So 60% failure rate when I was there every year. So 17 of us started, 2 graduated. One person graduated 2 years later. So you know, there was a tremendous amount of pressure. So it wasn't sort of just about freedoms, but it was really about a rigorous idea that you kind of really need to create a position and then be able to really talk about it. And when you do in levels of inquiry that are that deep and that profound and which don't necessarily have to be backed by architectural thinking, you can go to cinema to kind of, you can go to literature, you could go to philosophy, you could go to science and mathematics to kind of create an argument. With that level of freedom also comes a huge amount of rigor. And for me, I think the great learning was, I spent 5 years studying architecture. I never designed a building in the 5 years through school. And I've increasingly grown to believe, especially by the time I was in my 3rd year, that cities don't necessarily solve their problems through building. You kind of sometimes smaller enablers, and I was talking to Ranjit earlier, you see it almost, at times you see it almost like acupuncture, where small insertions in one point have great impact across other places or the zones where actually you're deploying those interventions. So sometimes increasingly I think about this, in terms of whether it's a light or whether it's a bridge across so many artificially, our cities are kind of now getting inundated with boundaries, primarily of class, right? So, but they really sort of begin to impinge on fundamental rights of citizens, right? So, how do you bridge certain gaps? How do you light up a place to make it safe? So I think I spent a greater part of my education really finding these solutions of inquiries into the cities, which were not necessarily about, it was about marketplace. And thinking about the city as like a successful city is not one which is of the renders that we see now, or the aspiration of the physical form of the city. And that's where we are. And that's where a lot of the planning visions come, is that we want to be Singapore, or we want to be, I don't know, New York or whatever. But the city as an enabler, I mean, that's the most successful city, is a city that enables somebody to fulfill their life to the best that they can, and so I think that's where sort of ideas of the city emerge, and so, but the art practice is very influenced by that structure of thinking around the city, that it is, while you observe it at times, I think the interventions and how do you comment about it, unfortunately within. And this binary of the architect and the artist that you mentioned holds within it some sort of boundaries that basically spill over into the practice as well. And there was a great deal of frustration for me in the first decade of practicing architecture in that box of the architect, which is essentially was saying that, look, I can build a building on a site, but the minute I go beyond it, I have no say in it. Not just me as architects, individual architects, but neither do the citizens, the mohallas, the residents have any significant say in terms of what happens to their neighborhoods. And I'll just say that this one simple building that took us a long time to build was a HIV and TB clinic on the edge of a railway line next to GB Road, which is a hardware market by day and a red light district by night. We were building essentially, it's surrounded by a hutment of jhuggi jhopris, basically. So unlike Bombay, where you have larger sort of settlements like Dharavi, Delhi it's fragmented. So you get 15, 20 hutments. So they're easier to kind of to remove should you kind of need to Photoshop the city at some point or the other, whether it's for the Commonwealth Games or for other reasons, etc. But what was really sad was that it was built as a primary healthcare center for people with TB and early detection of HIV, and later on as a medicine dispensing place. But as the building was completed, and they wouldn't open it for several months because the local politician was not available. But when we returned for the opening of it, all the slums around it had been demolished. So I saw this building almost looking like a tombstone, and literally the images of it at the base of it are of this sort of demolished sort of homes of about 30 or 40 homes are demolished. So you feel there's these sad moments, right, for us as people, So yeah.
That's what comes across very strongly at various points in your work, but certainly here, there's a sense that many of these works are they're tragic and elegiac in tone. They're like memoirs of loss, things breaking down. But also, I'm going to dance, as you said, too, between your architectural work and what you inherit there and what you're working on as an artist. I'm just thinking back to, in one sense, it's a legacy practice. You're taking forward Ranjit Khosla Design Studio, the beginnings of which were in a period where there was a possibility that architects could intervene in urban and rural spaces, and at the peri-urban, as we now call it.
Yes.
So it was a time both of hope, but a knowledge of the incipient authoritarianism that was to come across the 70s. In what way did you engage with this living legacy, and how have you taken it forward as an architect? Or where are the, as they say, pain points in dealing with this history?
Oh, the pain points. So I think growing up, I am very aware of this idea of the role an architect was still able to play well into the 80s. But I think this shifts significantly with liberalization. And I think so post-90s, this moment of architecture starts to really begins to evaporate as capital moves into start to define how the cities start to emerge. So by the time I start practicing, this is in 2002. So it's not the India where my father's practice had started, which was post the Nehruvian and pre the liberalization phase. So when I come in, I start to see the first buildings of, not the first, but the first shiny glass buildings of Gurgaon are emerging as that momentum is picking up. So those sort of spaces of inquiry were rapidly vanishing. And that if you wanted to have, say, you either sort of fell in line with strong sort of capital market, which is not the nature of the practice. Yeah. My father had given up his practice several years before I came. But I started, it was restarted as a small studio, and it remained small. I think for me, my inquiries into architecture soon were very much about kind of enjoying the detail of building. I mean, there was just a tactile sort of joy of creating spaces. And at that scale, that's been kind of very joyful. It was equally very frustrating to not have the larger kind of conversations, which is why eventually the art practice emerges. It starts as a critique of kind of forcing a conversation that goes beyond just the built form or what the client mandate may or may not be. So, I tried different things. I was not very good at writing. I tried to teach. I was not very good at that. But eventually I found that, I was able to probe these ideas quite sort of satisfactorily for myself at that point through an art practice. That was kind of, so yeah, there was no continuation, unfortunately, but not just for our practice. I think that can probably be said for most practices.
Absolutely.
There are several multi-generational practices, and I think Kaiwan has spoken about this also to other practitioners. They've either evolved into kind of falling in line with the larger narrative, or they've not sort of they've not survived in the same sense as they were earlier. It's a very different place.
No, that was exactly the history that we mapped in the State of Architecture,
Exactly.
which Rahul, Kevin, and I,
Yeah.
and in which
And I was a
you were a
small
participant.
part of that. Yes, yes, of course.
But it came about from this sense of how the architect who was in the early phase of the post-colonial visionary participant in the nation-building process, then eventually began to become a specialist who could be consulted, and then a voice of resistance who could be ignored.
Yeah.
So in a way, I mean, you just said it too, in a way you're trying to retrieve that sense of what it means to be a visionary architect through your artistic practice. But it leads me to ask another set of questions about who are your interlocutors, who's your audience? Is there a specialist knowledge of urban design questions that might be needed to respond to this work? I mean, I think it has a completely autonomous existence as sculpture, as visual provocation. But I'm just very interested in what it means to, so to speak, cultivate an audience. What are the kinds of forms of conversation that you might need to engage an audience in these larger questions from which your practice comes?
I'm going to come back to what I'd said earlier. I would say that yes, I think that's right. Yeah. I think the shows before this, I was always kind of very aware of kind of situating the practice within a larger and usually an architectural framework. So the show before this, I've constantly looked back at imaginations and propositions of utopias, and then critique them and saying that, look, the last show had a lot of references to Russian constructivists, and there's Tatlin, and there were sort of those structures, and I was kind of borrowing
Still ghosts of Tatlin.
So I was borrowing the color references, the reds and the blacks, and kind of talking about that, but seeing those structures as kind of now, I mean, dystopic and in some sense, this idea that it didn't pan out the way it was meant to be, or looking the show before that, I was kind of looking at Corbusier's the Radiant City, and this idea of how actually, and now you find sort of redevelopment. And today I was reading an article on about the Adani Dharavi redevelopment, but also whether it's the Ahmedabad riverfront redevelopment, whether it's Delhi where they have removed, and where you situate people. So they borrow kind of the visual language of modernism, but it doesn't pan out at all in that sense. So in a way, it's been really about a great deal of dejection within critiquing it. But the bouncing boards and the reference points have always been the modernist sort of, because we also have taken on those. We've taken on that book and saying, look, we will be this, city that is defined in the Western sense, and we will take its tools and we will create for it, whether it's from the 50s or whether it's from Singapore. So the point is that does become the point that we as architects have to critique. Like, I mean, it's I think it's upon us to at least sort of comment on that. So I think that has been very much the case. But I did reach a point where you sort of realize that this idea of bending, and I was saying this idea of resistance is kind of very central, because while you have political force and force of capital, or whether you have force of of identities that push hard upon citizens, there is a sense, particularly in South Asia, of it's not about breaking, it's about bending. Yeah. And bending holds, for me at least, within it some sense of resistance, accommodation, but also finding how you negotiate with the larger sort of, the larger narratives that start to define what our cities are. So I think that has been very, very important. That 2 shows ago it was called Mesocosm, which was that I was positioning that if the structures of the state are the macrocosm, whether built or whether of the written word, of law, the mesocosm is the in-between spaces where the citizens where our cities thrive to a great degree, which is oral cultures and ideas of social sort of ideas and contracts that exist, which are not necessarily stipulated by modern society, religion, or whatever other forms of governance that exist. Yeah. And it is within these spaces that we thrive and we exist and we are able to survive. I mean, in so many ways. So I think from there, the natural step for me at some level was about trying to find this dance of kind of of survival in all of this, because we also didn't have our cities decimated through the Second World War and kind of or built on land taken over like America was built on sort of so we kind of continue and in this sort of chaos somewhere here is this energy and but also joy, which is not to be kind of
True. Funny, as you were outlining this, 2 things came to me. One was very much Yona Friedman's ideas about informal architecture, the informal city, what gets made in terms of social relationships and temporary connections in the interstitial zones between built form. That was one set of things. The other thought that came to me, I've just been reading Keshav Aguha's brilliant novel, The Tiger's Share, which is really a Delhi novel. And one of the characters at that point says, the Barsati no longer exists. Yeah. Which to any of us who've had, from a distance, Delhi connections, the Barsati was a particular kind of meso space, not really allowed for by the bylaws and the statutes. And yet there, somewhere between intimacy and the larger plan. Yeah. But I'm also thinking of how your work is situated at this point of the push-pull between large-scale reinscription of urban space and urban experience, and how one might fight back. But I want to take those thoughts to the works themselves, because there's a kind of a micro-theater of these contending forces. And I'm particularly moved by these works, for instance, where there's a collision between an energy that will burn its way through and something that resists it to the last moment. Yeah. So could I draw you into a discussion of the materiality of the work, your choice of materials, and how you stage these very haptic, visceral collisions in material?
So material for me is of course very central, and I've very consciously up until this show, which is the first time I'm kind of slightly deviating from it, I have kept it very architectural. So it is always sort of, it was at some point I was working a lot with brick dust and cement, but it has remained in wood and in steel, and in some way I feel that it has kept me connected to, and also these are the materials I'm familiar with working with. My learnings have been about this. This is where I've learned my carpentry and my welding, etc., etc. But so I feel that they kind of tie into this, and equally, I think the choice of material for that work, which is called force mapping, is very much about this continuous kind of pressure. And I use intumescent paint, which is an architectural paint used primarily on steel buildings or on steel as well. Its intention is that it will prevent fire from spreading. Right. So its pure reason of existing is that it will give, in the event of a fire, it'll either sort of give the building a little more time before it eventually collapses, or you're able to kind of save the building. and the mark making is through a laser etching. So there's in the making of the work lies that conflict and the resistance, right? The resistance of one material while it is being kind of burnt in. But as you see over time, there are moments of eventual rupture, right? Because the first few parts of these are probably about 1 hour of laser etching on each one of those. But it's by the time they're at the last, that's about 60, 70 hours, of a laser making a drawing over this. And you basically, well, in a sense, what I find which was really drawn me to it are these islands of resistance that remain, and then the rest it doesn't. But I think it's important to acknowledge both of those conditions simultaneously. So I think I was in some way trying to do a time mapping or a cartography of our times in some ways. Maybe I don't know where in the line of time where we stand in this, but somewhere in between maybe, or maybe to the end. I don't know.
I mean, it's like a drama of the vital forces on the one hand and entropy and heat death on the other. But I also want to draw you out on how research has long been a part of your practices.
Yeah.
I found fascinating your story about tracing the migration of plant species, for instance, which came about as a way of expanding how we think about architecture and mobility and so on. So, if you want to dwell on that briefly and
on the migration of plants,
I want to then bring that back to the works.
In a sense, that was probably, now that I look back, the first sort of sculpture I had made, which was a third-year college project in a gallery called, I think it was called the Cubit Gallery, which is a gallery run by artists on King's Cross. And this was before King's Cross, and I find it really fascinating now if I go back to London and see King's Cross, this is totally gentrified. And it was at that time this wasteland behind King's Cross station, which was dangerous. There were murders there. I would go on these beats. Twice I went with the police cars.
Late 90s.
This would be mid-90s. So this would be, 96, I think. And it was a very, very unsafe space. And I was looking, and the final proposition was that actually it be made into a garden that is kind of well lit. And it was a dumping ground, so that it basically, there are these gas towers, I'm trying to recall it, but a part of it was also sort of readings of the plants that were there, which then moved me to the point that I was studying actually migration of plants, which is, it resonates in some sense now with cities as then I started to look at migrants to our cities. This was in the early part of the practice, but that work had I had suspended a railway line sort of like sculpture on the ceiling, and then every time someone would press a destination, seeds would basically drop. But there was a duality, because what was happening was that during colonization, people were bringing back.
Right.
So the fancy varieties were going off to the botanical gardens, but it was the others that were coming on the feet of traders and colonizers, and that were then spreading. So now you find like Buddleia was, for instance, a plant that you see growing all along the railway lines of England, which apparently draws its name from China, Buddha. So it comes from the word Buddha, and it came to England from China. But it was also that I was playing this game that, as the seeds would drop within the gallery, which was on the site, people would carry them on their shoes out into the space. So there was this sort of, I've always enjoyed that interplay, like I do maybe with the laser drawings, etc. Yeah. But I was sort of looking at migration at that point as well, and I then continued to see how, forces from, start to kind of really impact at that point landscapes, but now landscapes in a different way. And so that's sort of been quite central to the practice, which is, and for me, I didn't study art, so for my point of reference is being the city. It's always, my tools are architectural, my training is such, so it is kind of very much embedded in research up until this point, where I find, as I said, there is this point where I just kind of feel that I want to just kind of capture moments of transition rather than kind of necessarily positioning it within a larger historical context. I think I'm kind of at that point where, I'm trying to kind of grapple with the energies of transition rather than kind of looking at the transition.
So it's interesting because the title of your show comes from rocketry, from astrophysics, and it kind of links back to how I started this conversation, thinking back to a space-age childhood.
Yeah.
But it's almost as if you're suggesting that this might be where you lift off from this contextual way of thinking about your practice to something that might be.
And maybe the theoretical basis may be the gravitational pull from which one kind of tries to break away. But I think that there are freedoms that you get after kind of doing something for a slightly longer period of time, and I think I'm trying to take advantage of that at this point and not sort of. Sometimes you kind of feel that you need to. You're back at the A and trying to kind of have to defend every position, and maybe this is a moment where I'm doing a little bit of play as well. But I think I've arrived at that point to allow me to do that in some sense. At least that's what I kind of tell myself. But it's a hard thing to admit at one level, but also it has joy in it.
Yeah, on that note, I'm going to read not the embarrassing 5-year-old bits, but something else.
When I was in 7th grade, I had to read, in Hindi, I had to read a short story written by my grandfather in the NCRT about my mother. How about her childhood in Moscow. It's kind of, it's funny that, that you're here mentioning this.
So I'm going to quote from this passage. Bhisham Shani writes, "And Martand, betraying all of our gambits, got the highest degree in architecture last year. He came back home, and now he unties knots in all sorts of architectural problems." So I'm going to hold on to this idea of untying knots as problem solving, but also something that gives joy, which is what you talked about. But in this phase of our conversation, I would think about, because I'm very interested in how people inherit things that they may or may not use. They may not deploy those particular resources. They may discover new grounds of engagement. But through your mother, you're linked and your grandfather, you're linked very, very strongly to a landscape of communist cultural activism, to IPTA, to various models for how art and activism might come together and how one might perform one's politics. So could I draw you out on how also your grandparents lived in Moscow for 7 or 8 years?
Yes.
So could you talk, because this history is fast vanishing, particularly to younger people who, I realize now, even the notion of the Soviet Union, that term is unknown to a lot of young people. So could I draw you out on what this inheritance, this ethos, and both its politics and its creative possibilities, what did that mean to you growing up, and how has that played out in your work?
Wow, I wasn't expecting these questions, but it's a great point. But interestingly, what brought my parents together was that my father's diploma sort of thesis for 4th year and 5th year under Peter Cook, who headed Archigram, was that his thesis was called The Ideal Communist City.
Right.
And that's what he was working on. And while researching that, he came across some writings of my mother, who was doing a PhD in Moscow, and reached out. And so that so in some ways, you're absolutely right, communism kind of brings them together. He was definitely the black sheep of the family because everyone else was in the IAS or the IFS and doing other sort of very pursuing respectable careers. And he was, he'd given up chartered accountancy and had decided to become an architect, and this is what he was doing. But my mother has been sort of really gathering the history of my grandfather and his brother. and was because she went, the whole family, so my mother's entire family, sort of most of them studied in Moscow. They either studied film or physics or economics. So my mother studied literature. My grandfather was translating Tolstoy into Hindi. So the big art influence in my life was definitely my mother growing up, because um, she was making the posters for political protest in the house, and they were collages, and they were referencing all the collage work that was coming out from the constructivist period, like, that very rich and fertile, kind of incredibly creative, but not spoken about as much as kind of the Western kind of modernist movement.
Soviet avant-gardes,
Yeah.
Lissitzky and Tatlin and all of these people.
All of them. So I would sit, and then this is how I was introduced to it. So I was sort of familiar not just with that, but also grew up with Battleship Potemkin and Ivan the Terrible and Ballad of a Soldier. This incredible sort of Parajanov, and these are kind of all the influences that are sort of coming into me from the age of 5, 6, 7 till and while I'm being dragged to Vittalbhai Patel House to sit through sit under the table like Kola there, while sort of heated debates are going on around what the next sort of movement. I mean, they weren't part of the party, but my father was quite close to them. He's designed the CPM headquarters in Delhi. And then from there it moved to the Journal of Arts and Ideas. I mean, which was sort of Kasoli days. And so I kind of have memories of all of those meetings happening, not just in Kasoli, but also at home. So there is definitely the ideas of utopias and of all of the things that I come on to critique now are because in some way they are kind of the foundational aspects of my learning, So I think you're absolutely right, and theatre is one aspect which did not sort of I think my mother was the last of. She acted in Garam Hawa. That was the last small role that she had in it. But no, that the next generation did not have that. But the IPTA movement is spoken about a lot. I mean, less so now. I think everyone's a little older, but like growing up, it was an important part of it. I was very close to my grandparents, my nana nani, and so I grew up very much around all of these ideas. Maybe there was the difference may well be that I think I kind of come at it at a more cynical point, but maybe that's just the trajectory of where we are. And that, I sort of saw that arc of hope. And then, I maybe joined it at the other end. But I hope that in some way, the baton gets passed on and, some part of that narrative as for us, society and the role a lot of them played within it sort of remains, and I kind of carry it in a different form. But
Fantastic. Thank you because I know that this part of your life is rarely, if ever, discussed in architectural circles. So I just wanted to bring that in, particularly because we're thinking of a sensibility nourished by many arts. So I'm going to now really invite people to join in this. But before I do that, I'm going to be speaking at Jamia next week. And I hope to have coffee at the Castro Cafe, which you designed.
Castro Cafe. I don't think it's used anymore. Really? I went there recently with a friend. And I think the bones are there. It's holding together, but it is all shut. And but there's a cafeteria, and next to it is a M.F. Hussain gallery. That was one of the early projects. I think my second project that I'd done. But let me know. And my Nana's entire collection, his library was donated to Jamia.
That's right.
After he passed. So, that's wonderful.
Great, super. So this might be a good point to invite responses or observations or strenuous objections or anything else from all of you.
I don't like I like the way that you made the buildings kind of old. I really enjoyed that work. I also want to say that the way cities are built like over so many years, you have all sorts of different kinds of architecture within the same space. Like even in South Bombay, you have Art Deco, you have Gothic, you have more modern buildings, you have so many different layers almost. Like each time period brings its own style. So, uh, yeah.
Yeah. I try and situate I deliberately sort of situate very intimate domestic objects, even though I may be really and I think that sort of becomes like a bit of a continuous thread in my own sort of practice right now. And while it's important kind of to think about collective movements and trajectories, but they also kind of have this sense of its individual components, and so that's really what I'm the doors and windows and beds and doors, So, thank you.
Kevin, do you have good? Yeah, please.
You mentioned the tactile and the constructivist.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
So you mentioned Russia and the constructivist movement and all that. Those are really almost impressive and very hard kinds of movements when it comes to work. Do you find that collectors who are reviewing your work, once they learn about the conceptualization of it, is it difficult for them to have an entry point when they're used to seeing work that's sometimes easier to absorb, or that entry point is simple? So my question is it difficult for people to connect with your work when they hear about it? Not so much when they see it, right? It's beautiful work, there's no question about that. But is it more difficult for them to connect with it intellectually, or is it easier for them to connect with it emotionally?
Oh. I mean, honestly, I think any work can have readings at many levels, you see. So I've always tried not to do walkthroughs. I'm more comfortable talking about the larger ideas that I'm thinking about, or I may be referencing. So I think that what I find what I always enjoy is that people bring completely their own readings into it, and I think for me, it's a moment of a private practice in a sense, So it's important for me to not really define it beyond perhaps a title that may give a hint to it. It is Ranjit's questions that kind of led me to kind of talk about those aspects of it. I don't know. I think it all depends on who the viewer is to answer, and what their sort of interests are, what their sort of political leanings may be, what their sort of education or interests may be. I can't answer for that, but I've often mostly found people to be quite receptive to it, because it's not about hardness. I mean, if we look at the constructivist movements, these are great moments of euphoria for human civilization. You see, I mean, you see the fractures happening before the Cold War, during the Second World War and all. Those are kind of political ideas, but if you look at the movements, they really just all are imagining an egalitarian society for the future. That's kind of what it is. But it's not only Soviet. I mean, that then moves to the Bauhaus. It moves to Western Europe. I mean, some of the earlier incredible housing projects, happened in Vienna and Austria. And then a lot of these people then move to the UK, and you get Lubetkin, and you get Tecton. You get a lot of these incredible social housing projects that are very successful. These ideas also then cross the Atlantic and find voices there. So I don't see it as political. I see it as kind of actually just a great, wonderful moment of human condition, where you kind of after you have after moments of some form of oppression, you imagine kind of new futures. And I think that's what we all need to continually be doing, critiquing it and finding it. But how a viewer may see it, I'm not too sure. Depends on the viewer.
Yeah. But it's fantastic the way you do it. It is political. Euphoria is a politics.
Yeah.
And eventually it goes to New York. You have Gordon Matta Clark measuring out
Exactly.
property relations and ownership and presenting an interstitial city.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
goes all the way back to these beginnings in the avant-gardes. So yeah, it's also about keeping these ideals alive
Yeah.
through your art. I mean, depending on who's reading it, you could just see it as an object that resists interpretation or that is part of a celebration of this euphoric politics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have a question? Sana, you did.
I think you're talking about how you're interested in capturing the essence of transition. Is that something that would be a recurring theme in your work, or is that something that the moment?
Transition, not so much as momentum, I would say at this point at least. I think I'm kind of trying to capture momentum of that sort of but also I was just saying that how do you momentum inherently has motion and time as part of it. It's as its implied reading. Yet kind of a sculpture is static at some level, but how do you kind of create a past and a future with a static object is kind of what I'm kind of wrestling with.
Absolutely.
In some ways, like how some photographs do it also. There's static moments, but there's this wonderful photograph of the Anita Singh of it's a table and there are two cups, and that it was occupied before and it has a moment after, yet it remains sort of static. And I think that becomes, it's very interesting for me that how do you stretch time when you're just looking at a single moment in it. So
yeah, it's like the poetics of the interval in a way.
Yeah.
Also, when you look at the work there, it's like an orrery. You think the planets might rotate, or a molecular model.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of sense of motion held in reserve.
Yeah. So.
So most of these works, we had a few works by Martand in a show earlier last year, which was parallel to these two. And it had these cylindrical objects, which had brick dust and footmarks.
That was Andrea's show.
Yes,
Andrea, sure, yeah.
And for me, it was one show which I literally texted Martin and told that these works you've never, at least during my tenure with the gallery, I've never seen them before, and I was totally taken up by them. What interested me the most about them was, in all the works we have seen from Martin's practice, the human element was so evident that the footmarks of all these workers who are such an integral part of either constructing or deconstructing the city was there in his works, which is so not part of the current show. So why that set of work, and like, what is the idea behind, working with buildings, chairs, the domestic object, but the human is not so much out there in the works, between sculptures, installations.
That work, interestingly, was called Continuum because it was a drum that basically the idea was that it would just continuously tell infinitely the same story of migration. So it had, again, very inbuilt sort of aspect of time, but also time at a microcycle, but also at a larger cycles, right? As far as kind of, the absence, I don't know. I don't think one has to be, for me, the human presence is very strong in my work. But it doesn't necessarily have to be represented for it to be there for me. So that's why, so for me, all of these objects, the fact is that for me, the human presence is very central to the work in some way because of the singular objects I think about. I mean, without putting the human in it, I think the human being, the citizen is very, very central to, and their presence is very strong for me, like when I look at the work, So I don't think it's gone. I just think the modes of representation may have kind of shifted for me in some way. But that's a nice link, actually, to think about. because been talking about that, and if you saw that show, then
Yeah, I
I'm
did.
glad you. Yeah, I did like those series of works that I'd done.
I saw it at the Italian embassy, where
Yes.
it had a very particular kind of contradiction to the to the frame, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then here, so yeah.
Yeah, it was a different. It was quite a different exhibition here than
That's
it was.
right.
So you're one of the few people who actually probably saw it in both those spaces. You know.
Kevin was there for
The conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mustansir, did you have a question? No, you didn't. Sorry, but you have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you identify yourself more as an architect or as an artist?
I've never been asked that question before. Have I ever? No, of course.
And are the creative processes very different? Like, say, when you're doing pure architecture, do you have the kind of like on paper or you know, maybe, or do you think only as an architect then, or when you're doing an artistic work, do you always have that architectural aspect of that, or how does it go? Because on one hand, you have science in architecture, and on the other hand, as an artist, you have pure art. So how do you maybe draw a line, or how do you stop or alter your creative process?
I think that how you define an architect is the starting point, I would say. So I don't think, for me at least, an architect is not just one who builds a building. For me, an architect who teaches is also an architect. An architect who writes the history is also an architect. Then there are people who imagine futures like Archigram did, or Super Studio did, or NATO, which is narrative architecture today, did. They kind of, put out and had profound influence on architectural trajectories moving into the late 20th century and beyond that. They're also architects. So I think that first of all, the definition of the architect as the person who practices to build a building is limiting in some way. So if I start looking at the broader idea of the architecture, then I think the boundaries already begin to blur, because then the next question is, how do you define an artist?
Yeah.
So, I think that why? That would be the question. And in terms of practice, however, I think that they manifest themselves completely differently because of the nature of the architecture that I do. But I'm about to embark on my second innings as teaching architecture. So that adds another layer of architecture to the way I practice. But yeah, I think in its making and its imagination, they are fundamentally different. I mean, but the tools of kind of how I think about it are the same. So it's kind of like I don't feel the need for the binary in some senses.
And we didn't even talk about your birding and your commitment to the natural world.
The birding, yes.
That will clearly remain for another moment.
The birding is for another sort of, yes. Yeah. That's a little bit thrust upon me, but that's a generational sandwich that I find myself between my two sons and my father, who are very keen birders, and me, who forget seasonally all the birds and have to then kind of remember it all again. But that's a little bit thrust on me, the birding sandwich. But I do enjoy it very much.
Which probably brings us to. Was that what that alarm was for?
That alarm was like, this has gone on too long.
Okay, but probably organically brings us to the vote of thanks.
Thank
Thank you. Wow, thank you. That was really wonderful. Thank you.